Well, folks, it turns out the Premier League is corrupt, always has been, and every team that's ever been involved in it needs to be punished. And when I say punished, I mean seriously punished. As you can see, the Premier League at the start of this save, quite a few points deductions going on. In fact, every team in there has a points deduction to some extent or another. And the way we've worked out the points deductions, we've gone back through the entire history of the Premier League and worked out how many seasons every team has had in it. And depending on how long they've been in the Premier League, their punishment is bigger. What are they being punished for? Premier League is what they're being punished for. You don't need any more information than that. But for each year a team has spent in the Premier League since its inception back in the 90s, that team will receive a 3-point deduction and a 1-year transfer embargo. We're limiting the points deductions to 30 points per season because otherwise it just gets ridiculous. We'd have teams finishing on negative points. Plus, those ones that are getting points deductions for the full 30 odd years in the Premier League, they deserve to be punished for more years. They've done more Premier League. So this is what the first season looks like. Let me go into it in a little bit more detail. So there are 6 teams that have actually received the full maximum punishment. The 6 teams that have been in every season of the Premier League. And those 6 teams are each getting a 32-season transfer embargo plus a 96-point deduction, which will be 30 points this season, 30 points next season, 30 points the season after, and a 6-point deduction this season after that. Those 6 teams, Arsenal, Chelsea, Everton, Liverpool, Manchester United, and Tottenham. If we pick one of those, you can see that Arsenal start the season on a 30-point deduction and have a transfer ban in place until 2055. 32 years of transfer ban to punish them for 32 years being part of the Premier League. Because remember, the Premier League is the problem. There are a couple of exceptions to the punishment. The main exception you see in the Premier League is Everton, who despite having been in every season of the Premier League, because of the way this is a football manager thing, let's make it canon. You can't have more than 1 points deduction the same season for any different things. And because they already have a points deduction in place this season, their punishment is going to be running 1 year behind everyone else's. So they've actually only got a 10-point deduction this year, but we'll get 30 points next year, year after that. And then after everyone else is finished, Everton are still going to be sat there on a 6-point deduction. So they're slightly different. There are 2 teams further down in the pyramid who are in a similar situation. Both in League One. Reading already have a real world points deduction in place, as do Wigan. So their points deductions for Premier League are also being delayed as well. But you can see it's not just the teams that are currently in the Premier League who are taking the punishment. Poor old Oldham, who have since fallen all the way down to the National League, still get a 6-point deduction and a 2-year transfer embargo because they had 2 seasons in the Premier League. MK Dons, they stole Wimbledon's football club. They can have Wimbledon's punishment. So MK Dons getting a 24-point deduction and 8-year transfer embargo. You've also got Bradford and Swindon down in League 2 who are being punished. In League 1, there's quite a few teams down here. Wigan and Reading, we've already mentioned, on their delayed punishments, but also punishments for Barnsley, Bolton, Charlton, Derby, Portsmouth and Blackpool to varying degrees. The Championship is absolutely full of points deductions. You can see there's only 5 teams in the Championship who aren't going to start the first season with a points deduction of some kind. And there are also a number of teams in the Championship who will be getting that multi-year points deduction as well. For example, Leeds, Leicester, I think Sunderland as well have had more than 10 seasons in the Premier League. So they'll be having multi-year points deductions as well. Arguably, the team who stand to benefit the most from this are one of the 3 teams who've only had a 1-year punishment, 3 points deducted, 1-year transfer embargo. There are 3 of those teams: Luton, Swindon and Blackpool, I think, are the other one. Yeah, Blackpool are the third one, each only spending 1 year in the Premier League. But Luton, of course, their 1 year is this year. So they now suddenly have this huge advantage in this first season where they're still in the Premier League. The Premier League continues. They can't do transfers for a year, but only have a 3-point deduction. So whereas it looked like guaranteed relegation for Luton in reality, in game, there's 11 teams who start 27 points behind them. Luton have a pretty good chance of staying in the league. And if we look at the season preview, they actually find themselves third favourites to win the Premier League because the in-game odds take into account these point deductions. So the game thinks we're going to see Fulham, Crystal Palace and Wolves all relegated. Manchester City expected to be down in 8th place. Arsenal down in 10th. Liverpool down in 9th. Everton, because their points deduction is delayed, have got a real chance of winning the league this year. And Brentford, probably the strongest team to have a small deduction, just the 9-point deduction for Brentford and the 3-year transfer embargo. So Brentford would be considered amongst the favourites for winning the Premier League this season as well. Why are we doing this, I hear you ask? Because Premier League, I've mentioned it a couple of times now, the Premier League is trying to ruin football. There's too much money in it. It never should have happened in the first place. We're just trying to re-level the playing field, redistribute some of that money, and by punishing the teams who've benefited the most from it, theoretically, it should level out the playing field a little bit, give some of the smaller teams a chance to catch up. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. A couple of anomalies at Manchester City, of course, despite being the current dominant team, are actually going to have a smaller long-term points deduction and much shorter transfer ban than the other big teams because they did spend a few years outside of the Premier League, as did Newcastle, who'll also benefit in that way, assuming when we get to the point where that makes a difference, they still have their money in place. Obviously, for the most of the next 30 years, they're still both going to be relying on players that come through their own youth system, which again could well end up benefiting Man City. And there are going to be some teams who are really seriously going to suffer from this, possibly unfairly so, the likes of Blackburn and Sunderland and Leicester and Southampton, Leeds, who've spent a long time in the Premier League but are no longer there, are having these massive points deductions, multi-year points deductions and transfer bans that could see them tumble down through the leagues. Poor old Bolton as well, a 30-point deduction in League One. They shouldn't have spent so much time in the Premier League, and hopefully, if nothing else, it kills off MK Dons, who are down 24th place in League Two, minus 24 points. They're surely not catching that up. If we look at the season preview, the game expects them to finish rock bottom, get relegated out of the Football League, and hopefully disappear from existence. That would be a wonderful thing if we manage to achieve that. So let's jump forward a year, see how this first year pans out, and then we'll as long as it stops Man City winning the league, that's the main goal. It didn't. It didn't stop them winning the league. Even with 30 points deductions, I mean, that's pretty incredible, actually, that what Manchester City, Arsenal, Liverpool, Man United, all getting into the Champions League despite their 30 points deductions. Obviously, it is bonkers to see a Premier League being won by a team on just 53 points. Luton, despite only having a 3-point deduction, still came this close to getting relegated. That is genuinely pathetic. Poor old Brentford, who were pre-season favourites, they've still finished in the bottom half of the table as well. And yeah, I didn't expect Man City to still win the league. They have. Obviously, they still have a really strong team. We've not taken any of the players away. They're not going to be able to sign any more for 20 odd, 25 plus years. So they are going to have to rely on their youth systems, which will benefit the likes of Man City, Chelsea, Man United, who traditionally have very good youth setups. But certainly in the short term, it doesn't seem to have punished anyone other than, I guess, Fulham are probably feeling quite hard done by finishing the season on just 2 points. If we drop down the leagues just to see what's gone on down here, Leicester still able to win the Championship even with a 30-point deduction, so they've got themselves promoted back to the Premier League. Leeds also with their 30-point deduction have been promoted as well, but Millwall have probably benefited more than anybody, of course, never having previously been in the Premier League, so they didn't have the points deduction that the likes of Cardiff, Southampton, Ipswich, Norwich, everyone who was chasing them had those points deductions. Millwall didn't, so so they have made it to the Premier League. But rock bottom, we have Sheffield Wednesday, Sunderland, Coventry also getting relegated, Blackburn, West Brom, Middlesbrough. These are the teams who struggled to overcome those points deductions compared to the other teams around them. In League One, that is insane. Reading, who are really, really struggling in real life, obviously only have the 4-point deduction from real life. So their Premier League reduction will come in next year when they hit the Championship. But I think even that's only a small one. They only spent a couple of years at that level. So Reading getting promoted, and then Charlton and Bolton, who I think had the biggest points deductions in this league, both getting relegated out of this division. Derby and Portsmouth, as you would expect, both struggled as well because they had significant points deductions. Obviously, all of these former Premier League teams are still going to have to cope with transfer embargoes long term as well. And then in League Two, MK Dons, even with a 24-point deduction, managed to survive. At least they've still got 8 years of transfer embargo, but we didn't manage to get them gone. Poor old Swindon. To be fair, Swindon only had a 3-point deduction. They can't blame this relegation on Premier League punishment because they finished 13 points adrift of Harrogate at the bottom of the league. Bradford might feel a little bit hard done by that. Their 6-point deduction looks like it caused them to miss out on the playoffs. And then lastly, checking in on Oldham, who... Hold on, we have to go back a year to see their points deduction. Oldham last year finishing 11th, so their 6-point deduction didn't make any difference at all. So, first season done. That means transfer embargoes are now over for Luton, Swindon and Blackpool. Those 3 teams can now start doing transfers. So, Luton, despite nearly getting relegated, will now be one of only 2 Premier League teams that can actually do transfers, the other one being newly promoted Millwall. So you'd expect Luton and Millwall to do quite well next year. Also, points deductions have now ended for more than half of the teams who got them. Only half of the 50 teams that have played in the Premier League have played in it for more than 10 seasons, which is a cut-off from multi-year deduction. So there are current Premier League teams that won't be punished next season, including Wolves, Burnley, Bournemouth, Brighton, Forest, Sheffield United, and of course, Brentford and Luton, who we mentioned before. So let's go forward another year and see if we start to see the rise of Luton and Millwall. And in fact, it was the rise of Brentford, who have finished the season as Premier League champions. Obviously, they didn't have a points deduction. They are still in a transfer embargo, though, so they weren't able to buy their way to success like I guess Luton have, who've managed to finish 8th and qualify for the Conference League. Millwall, despite no points deduction and being able to do transfers, have still managed to get relegated, along with West Ham, who would have still been on a 30-point deduction as a long-term Premier League team, and Everton, who entered into their 30-point deduction for the first time. But Brentford winning the league, I mean, I guess we were going to get something weird happen sooner or later. Man City still managing to finish second, Brighton, Chelsea and Liverpool, the other Champions League qualifiers. And you're starting to see some of the teams that are suffering with these points deductions really start to suffer long term as well. If we move down into the Championship, Burnley winning the league, Norwich and Hull getting promoted with them, and Blackburn, who still had a 21-point deduction this season, getting relegated bottom of the league. If they hadn't have had their deduction, they'd have finished mid-table. So it'd be interesting to see what happens to Blackburn from here. Their points deductions now end, but obviously still in transfer embargo long term. And then the only team that had a points deduction in League One this season were Wigan, who had their 24-point deduction delayed by a year, which again has robbed them from their lower mid-table spot and caused them to finish rock bottom. And then I don't think there are any deductions at all affecting the lower leagues now. And actually MK Dons, despite the punishment we gave them last year, have managed to get promoted back up to League One, which is hideous. What I do want to do is see if there were big transfers from Luton and Millwall. So if we look at the Premier League transfers, there are some of these transfers that were already scheduled to go through. So they have gone through. Chelsea and Tottenham both getting players there. But interestingly, despite having that unfair advantage and being able to do transfers, we didn't get a load of transfers for Luton, although actually we want to be looking at this year, don't we? So lots of players being sold from Premier League teams, pre-arranged transfers going through, but actually Luton did spend big. Luton spending money on players all the way through, and that's why they've managed to finish higher up in the league. You see Millwall have done a few transfers as well, and I don't think there's any more of these pre-arranged Premier League transfers now, so you'll start to see less stuff like that happening. And will Arsenal regret stuff like selling Reiss Nelson to Bayern Munich, bearing in mind they can't sign any new players for another 31 years? You think you could probably keep a guy like that around. That is an interesting decision. So now, having come to the end of the second season, the transfer embargoes are now over for Bradford, Cardiff, Huddersfield, Oldham and Barnsley. So I guess, I mean, they're all down in the lower leagues. They're probably just going to carry on where they are. It might not make much of a difference to them, but another half of the remaining teams are now out of their points deduction period. So that includes Fulham, Crystal Palace, former Premier League champions Leicester and Blackburn now not having points deductions. Obviously, these clubs are all still in transfer embargoes, but the points deductions are now getting to the point where it's only the really big teams who've still got them. If we push forward into this coming season, there are only 7 teams in the Premier League with points deductions, and actually because of Man City spending less time in the Premier League than their rivals, City only having the 21 point deduction in this coming season compared to the 30 points deduction that Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Man United and Spurs will still be facing. So maybe Man City just had the one season not winning the league because they only missed out by 9 points. And they're getting those 9 points back through the deduction. Yeah, Man City, I don't think we've done much work in toppling them as part of this, have we? And as expected, City back to being Premier League champions again. And with the youth system that they've got, even with a 20-plus year transfer embargo still hanging over them, all of their expected rivals have also got those transfer embargoes. So I guess Man City really will start to dominate from here. Interesting to see that both Newcastle and Tottenham getting relegated. Newcastle with only the 27 point deduction, but obviously not being able to do transfers has really affected them. Spurs with a 30 point deduction and will still have another 6 point deduction next year as well. So they've got to rebuild from the Championship with a point deduction in place. Man United narrowly missing out. They'll be one of the few teams that still has the 6 point deduction next year. Interesting to see how well Man City, Arsenal and Liverpool have coped with the squads that they've got compared to Manchester United, Spurs and Newcastle. Chelsea just sat there in the middle doing Chelsea things. Luton moving back down the league now. Their little burst of being the only team that could sign players doesn't seem to have lasted very long. If we have a look at the transfers that took place, you can see that Luton are still able to throw the cash around, but they're not really throwing it around to the extent that you would think they would when they're the only team that can do transfers. Very strange policy from them. And then if we jump back down through the leagues as well, just to see what's gone on lower down. So points deductions, Everton still on a points deduction in the Championship. A 30 point deduction for them means Everton very nearly got relegated again, only surviving by the 1 point. And they've still got another season of 30 point deductions. Everton might be in trouble here. West Ham with their 24 point deduction still managing to get promoted. So they're going to be back in the Premier League with no points deduction. Likewise, Southampton, who with a 12 point deduction still got promoted. Fulham's point deduction is already over. So those 3 teams heading back to the Premier League should be fine. But we need to be keeping an eye on Everton in particular, because this might not end well for Everton. Interesting. Also worth noting, transfer embargoes are now over for Reading and Brentford. Obviously, Reading not massively relevant, but Brentford are, because Brentford are still in the Premier League and actually won it 2 years ago, or a year ago. So they're now able to sign players. We could see the return of Brentford, because Manchester City, who I guess are Brentford's big rivals, have still got more than 20 years of transfer embargo in place. And now it's only the big 6 teams that are still going to have points deductions, plus Everton, who are running a year behind. So Brentford back to winning the league if they spend well? Nope, it was Man City again. And in fact, Brentford finishing down in 9th place has got to be pretty disappointing. Did they not do transfers? Not really. They signed a bunch of players on free transfers, but didn't actually spend any money, which seems insane from a team that has that unfair advantage and has just decided not to use it. This was the last year of points deductions for the 4 remaining big teams that are still in the Premier League. So Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool and Man United. It is now a level playing field for those big clubs going forward. Although remember, they are still under transfer embargo for a long time. Luton still enjoying their little unfair advantage that they had from the start, seemingly responding slightly better to it than Brentford, and Norwich, Palace and Burnley getting relegated. Let's see what's happened to Everton, because that's the other interesting story. Everton, where are they? Okay, so this year with the 30-point deduction, they nearly got promoted. They actually would have ended on 96 points if they hadn't have had the deduction. They're still going to have another 6 points deducted next year, but a 6-point deduction didn't stop Spurs, who've managed to get back to the Premier League. Newcastle, who of course didn't have the points deduction because they didn't spend the full 32 years in the Premier League. They're back into the Premier League as champions as well. And at the moment, this doesn't seem to be having as big an impact as maybe I anticipated that it would. Going forward, Everton are going to be the only team with a points deduction, just that extra 6 points for them because they started a year late. And I don't think we've got any transfer embargoes that end this year either. So let's go forward a few years and see what happens a few years down the line. Right, so it is now 2030. So we've gone 3 years further on. We now have no more active points deductions, at least as a result of this. Teams can still get points deducted for other things. And the transfer embargoes have ended for Hull, Ipswich, Watford, Sheffield United, Birmingham, Bournemouth, Brighton, Derby, Forest, Portsmouth, QPR and Swansea are all out of their transfer embargoes. Arsenal won the Premier League. Manchester City finishing runners-up. Luton are now a Champions League team, though. Brentford also up there challenging for Europe as well. I don't see the return of Everton in here anywhere. Chelsea actually winning the league a couple of times, so their bonkers transfer policy in real life in recent years finally paying dividends with what I guess is quite a young team. I mean, if we have a look at the Chelsea team, we are now, 7 years in the future. Obviously, all these teams are pretty much going to be like their real life counterparts, but Chelsea's is that little bit younger because it was such a young team in the first place. The Arsenal team that's just won the Premier League again looks very familiar. There's not much in the way of young players starting to break through at these clubs. Manchester City, who have now started to drop off. They've not won the league for 3 years. I guess that's what happens when you don't have the likes of De Bruyne in the team anymore. Seems like they've also sold Haaland, which seems like an insane thing to have done in the circumstances. They have a very old Bernardo Silva still in their team. But why on earth did they sell Erling Haaland? When did they just let him go at the end of his contract? Where is Erling Haaland? Haaland. Oh, he is at Man City. Was he injured? He wasn't in the team. Okay, he's still there. Ignore me. I just couldn't see him. I don't know why I can't see him. He's not in the team or on the bench. He's injured at the moment. That's why. That explains. It would have been bonkers to sell Erling Haaland. So Everton did recover and get back into the Premier League as soon as their points deductions ended. Everton are back. Spurs also back in the Premier League as well. So actually, it looks like there's not much long-term damage that's been done by those points deductions. Obviously, the thing that's really going to start to kick in now is the transfer embargoes, because the bigger the team, the longer the transfer embargo. There are still a lot of teams under transfer embargo. I mean, Blackburn, for example, have still got another 10 years of transfer embargo, despite the fact that they are, they've been between the Championship and League One. They've still got 10 more years of punishment, and that is really going to start to kick in. So I think what we're going to focus on now is checking in on teams at the end of their embargoes and seeing where they end up. In fact, before we do that, are these teams still competitive in Europe? Arsenal won the Champions League 2 years ago. So yes, at the moment, the old man teams are still pretty competitive in Europe as well. The transfer embargoes aren't stopping English teams win the Champions League. So we've got another 5 years forward, and the first thing that is springing out to me is, after a little period of Arsenal dominance, the teams that can do transfers are now starting to take control. Brighton picking up a Premier League win and Luton winning it the last few years. Of course, they've been able to do transfers for longer than anybody and presumably are really starting to throw the cash around at this point because they can. man. There's not a huge number of big incoming transfers to the Premier League. There's still some big transfers on their way out, which is bonkers. Stop selling big expensive players that you need to keep, Premier League teams, you silly gooses. But if we have a look at the most recent season to see how things are starting to shake out, Luton, Brentford, Bournemouth, they're teams that can do transfers. The ones that are still hanging on, I guess, are the ones that had the younger teams to begin with the better youth setup. So Arsenal, Man City, Chelsea still well in their embargoes, but clinging on. Manchester United very much less so, and they've still got another, where are we? It's 2035 now. They're still under embargo for another 20 years, as are Arsenal, Chelsea, Man City, everybody else, but Man City not quite so long. So we have now had another 5 years pass, so that's more embargoes have ended. Charlton, MK Dons, Sheffield Wednesday, Wigan, Burnley, Coventry, Norwich, Stoke and Wolves all now out of their transfer embargoes, and Bolton as well. I've just checked in on that. So I mean, where are Wolves, for example? They've obviously collapsed down the leagues. They're in the Championship. It's not that much of a collapse, to be honest, but they're now able to do transfers again. They've been in the Championship for a long time off the back of not being able to do them, but they have been getting pretty close and can now spend money. I wonder if they're hoarding money. I mean, we have got the in-game editor on, so let's have a look at the finances of a club like Wolves. Is that 59? Hold on, where's the... Okay, that's for a minute I thought they had over 500 million. No, it's like 59 million. So they've not actually got a huge amount of money, although I guess for the Championship that is still quite a lot. It's just, are the boards taking money out of the teams? Let's just look at the teams at the top of the Premier League and see how much money they've got, bearing in mind they've not been able to spend any. So if we look at Arsenal's finances, I mean, I guess that is quite a lot of money, 250 odd million. But not necessarily as much as you'd expect. Are they paying huge salaries? Kinda. They kind of are. It does still seem like there's a lot of money being taken out somewhere. I'm not entirely sure where. Let's just look down through the league, see if we can notice anybody who is particularly out of place. We're looking for former Premier League teams, really, that have absolutely collapsed off the back of all this happening, and it doesn't look like there are any at the moment. We are, 12 years into this? Wigan down in non-league, I guess, have suffered. Bolton also down in non-league. They're both teams who are probably still in transfer embargoes, actually. Wigan are not. Bolton probably are, though, I would think. Yeah, Bolton have still... In fact, Bolton come out of their transfer ban tomorrow. So they are maybe going to be able to start buying their way back up the leagues, or at least being able to bring in some free transfers so they don't have to rely on their own youth setups anymore. So it'd be interesting to see where Bolton get to in the next 5 years or so. So 5 more years have passed and it is still, on the whole, the teams that can spend money, as you would imagine. Brentford, Brighton and Brentford. Chelsea... obviously still very much in their own transfer ban. They've still got another 15 years of transfer ban at this point. And I imagine we are now getting to the point where the majority of the real players are starting to disappear. And it really is a test of who's got the best youth setup. So for Chelsea to go and win the league purely off the back of their own young players, when there's teams around them able to spend money, I guess is testament to just how good that Chelsea youth setup is. Because again, just to confirm, there are not any incoming transfers to these big teams. So Chelsea have done remarkably well there. I'm trying to see if there's any of the other traditional big teams who are falling off. I mean, the fact that Arsenal are still up there, Man United, Chelsea, Spurs and Liverpool both getting relegated in this season. If we just check in on which embargoes have ended. So now West Brom have come out of theirs. Palace, Leeds, Middlesbrough, Sunderland, Blackburn, Fulham, Leicester. All their embargoes have ended. In fact, there's no more embargoes that end now until Southampton's in another 8 years. So this is the majority of those transfer embargoes coming to an end now, apart from the ones that have been in the Premier League a really, really long time. So Villa have dropped down to the Championship. Fulham, Everton down in the Championship as well. So they, of course, were punished a little bit later than everyone else and haven't really recovered. They are very much a Championship team now, and they're still going to be, they've got the longest embargo. They've still, interestingly, they don't have an end date on theirs. They've not managed to sneak away around it, have they? No. I think they've got the same end date as the other big clubs. I don't know why it's not showing as them having an end date. Liverpool down in the Championship have still got another 15 years of transfer embargo. Spurs, West Ham, still under embargo. Let's have a look to see if we've got anyone else who is lower down than you would expect them to be. It doesn't look like it. Sheffield Wednesday, Tamworth have made it up to League Two. Maybe they had some handsome guy with a beard come in and take control and lead them there. I'm looking for Bolton. Oh, Bolton did make it back into the Football League, although only to League Two. Now they're able to buy players again. Is there any former Premier League teams deep down? Oh my word, Blackburn. Blackburn are down in the National League North. Are they still in their embargo? Their embargo ends now, but they are down in the National League North as a result of it. So I don't know if they're going to be in a position to actually bring in any decent players, but at least they can bring some players in now. But Blackburn have looked like they've suffered more than anybody, being hammered. Look at the state of that. It's interesting that they held on for a long time. They were still in the Championship 5 years ago, but they've just collapsed. They have absolutely collapsed over the last 5 years, down to the National League North, and very much going to need to bring in some players this summer, you would think. Do we have an equivalent in the South? Doesn't look like it. Right, we're going to go forward 8 years now to the end of Southampton's embargo and see what goes on. So 8 more years later, this is the end of Southampton's embargo, so we'll check in on them in a minute. Very interesting to see Chelsea winning the Premier League again. This is Chelsea, who are still under transfer embargo for another 7 years. They had the maximum embargo. It shows just how good Chelsea's youth setup is, that they're able to go out and win a Premier League completely with new gen players that have come through their own youth setup. This is what happens when they keep them rather than loaning them all out and then selling them because they can't get in their team, I guess. The majority of the rest of the teams in the top end of the Premier League are the ones that are able to buy players now. Millwall, Brighton, Brentford. Man City still up there. Again, we know they've got a great youth system. Interesting to see Wrexham have made it all the way up here. Luton still competitive. Who's been winning it? If we look at the past winners, Brentford have been having a lovely time. Brentford and Brighton. Who would have thought that arguably the two best run teams in the Premier League would really benefit from getting the big spending teams out of their way? Brentford winning the Premier League, 7-8 times in a row. They've picked up 2 Champions League wins in that time as well. 11 Premier League titles now for Brentford, who weren't punished for very long at all. And Brighton, equally well run. They've got 1 Champions League, a couple of Premier Leagues. So the well run clubs thrive. The entire plan has worked. This was all about rebalancing the Premier League and rewarding the teams who deserve to be rewarded, not the ones who spent the most money. And look, it's working. Right, we're going to try and find Southampton, who, to be fair, they've done incredibly well there. Their embargo has just ended and they've managed to keep themselves at Championship level. They did drop down to League Two very briefly, but they've made their way back up again. Of course, Southampton are another team who traditionally have had a decent youth setup, and they're now in a position to start bringing in new players. Tottenham, still under their embargo, are not having a very nice time. They're bobbing back and forth between the Championship and the Premier League. I guess with only 7 years of embargo left, they're just banking on, as soon as they can get the money together, getting back up into the Premier League that way. They don't want to do a Blackburn and fall any further. Manchester United also in the Championship as well is interesting. We're looking again for big clubs fallen on hard times. We're looking for Blackburn more than anything as well to see where they've ended up. Have they just collapsed out of the league setup entirely? Sheffield Wednesday were a team who were punished, but not for long enough for it to still be impacting them now, you would think. Right, there's no sign of Blackburn yet. Have they fallen out of the playable leagues entirely? Blackburn. Oh, Oh, we broke Blackburn, boys and girls. I am sorry, Blackburn fans. We broke you. You're done. You've kind of you've fallen out the bottom of the National League North. You made it back, but you've fallen out again, which is interesting because you have been able to sign players for the last 8 years, but the ones you've been signing have been trash, and it's not made any difference. Blackburn are done. I mean, I guess they were one of the really early teams to benefit from buying a Premier League. So I guess fair enough if we were trying to punish the Premier League and everything it stands for. If we can get Chelsea and Man City as well. Talking of former Premier League winners, Leicester, 9th in the Championship, so they've not collapsed. Oh, poor old Blackburn. Right. Breaking news, Manchester City's transfer embargo is the next one to end. Their embargo ends in 3 years. They are still competitive in the Premier League. If we have a look at the season that has just ended, Manchester City still qualified for the Champions League off the back purely of their own young players. They are not bringing in any signings. In 3 years' time, they get to start spending money again. And money is usually in fairly plentiful supply at Manchester City. They've got a transfer budget at the moment of £230 million. And I imagine they are pretty good to spend it. So let's see what happens when City come out of their embargo years before everybody else. So City's embargo is now over and they have qualified for the Champions League even without being able to spend money. In fact, 6 teams qualifying for the Champions League. We've thought we were ruining the Premier League here. It seems like it hasn't had that effect at all. And these teams are still incredibly competitive in Europe. 9 teams qualified for Europe. Bearing in mind, we're nearly 30 years in the future and there's not been any incoming transfers for the big clubs in that time. It's still the most reputable league in the world. Is there still, I mean, I guess there are big transfers. There you go. You can see Man City immediately able to start spending again. And goodness me, did they start spending, throwing the money around as soon as they were able to. So I guess this is Man City re-establishing themselves back in control of the Premier League. I have to hand it to Chelsea. They have done it really, really well. They've still got, along with the other of the original big 6, they've still got 4 more years of embargo left. But the fact they're still competitive, it hasn't really hurt Chelsea at all. Looking for the other bigger teams, it looks like Arsenal are gone. Arsenal held on for a long time, but they are gone. Where are Arsenal? Arsenal down in 7th place in the Championship. So again, similar to what we said with Spurs before, they just need to cling on at this point. They've got 4 more years of embargo left. They need to cling on and try and rebuild as soon as they can. In fact, did Spurs make it back to the Premier League? No, so Spurs haven't clung on. Spurs are not in League One. Where are Spurs? Have I just missed them? Tottenham. Oh, they are in the Championship. I just missed them. Okay, so Spurs, similar to Arsenal, similar to Man United, still got 4 more years of this embargo to go. If we just look at the Champions League, presumably there are still English teams winning it. I mean, Brentford have won it several times. We already knew about that. Brighton. So, I mean, it's not that the English teams are dominating it, but I guess the English teams are just doing okay in it, doing well enough to keep their coefficient high. And I guess can't really complain. How much did Man City spend in their first window of being able to spend again? So 288 million. They took 2 players off of Arsenal. It seems very harsh. First thing they're going to do, punish Arsenal, have them off of them. And yeah, City are back and they're back spending. So it hasn't really helped them. They actually finished 3rd, 5th, 3rd, 2nd, were able to spend again, finished 6th. So perhaps they were better off relying on their own young players. I guess they've still got a ton of money to spend this coming. Yeah, they've still got 300 odd million to spend again. So, or is that 30 actually? there's too many zeros. Actually, it's only 30 million. Only 30 million in a world where other teams can't spend anything. Right, I think we're just going to push through to 2055 now, when everyone's embargoes will be ended. A couple of them end a little bit earlier. So you've got Villa and Newcastle. Theirs ends in a couple of years. West Ham's ends next year, I think. And then everyone else in 55. So that's Arsenal, Chelsea, Everton, Liverpool, Man United, and Spurs. In fact, where are Everton? Everton... That's not the same Everton. I was very confused for a second there. Everton? Everton? Oh, Everton. Oh, bless them. They've done a Blackburn. They've still got 4 more years of embargo. Oh, they might not make it. Because they are struggling. Everton may not still be a thing when we're back in 5 years' time. So this is the last season that anybody had a points deduction. So Chelsea, you have to give them bonus points for still being a top 6 Premier League team after a 96-point deduction spread over 4 seasons, a 32-season transfer embargo. Chelsea are still a top 6 team. That is pretty impressive. Man City able to spend again, and it doesn't seem to have made any difference to them, which is bizarre. If we just dance down through the league, so Arsenal still in the Championship, although clinging on, really clinging on, but obviously can now spend again. Spurs, likewise. I think we need to go and find Everton, though. Everton are still in the National League North, and they are now going to be allowed to spend again. So they might... Oh, they did drop out of the playable leagues. Did Blackburn ever make it back once they came out of their embargo, or Blackburn just a nothing now? Blackburn. Okay, Blackburn are in the National League North as well. So they're trying to battle their way back up. Right, let's go a couple of years beyond it. Once teams are able to start spending again, presumably everything just goes back to the status quo. And that is your final Premier League table 3 years after everyone was allowed to start spending again. Really interesting that Chelsea, after being able to spend money, started to finish lower than they had done for years. So clearly spending money for Chelsea, not quite as good as relying on their youth players. Maybe a lesson for real life Chelsea there. They're better off relying on their own youth, which is actually quite good. But Brentford definitely benefiting from this more than anybody, which I guess if we were going to guess beforehand who would be most likely to benefit from this, Brentford probably would have been a good bet. They only had a 9-point deduction. They only had a 3-year transfer embargo. They've got 13 Premier League winners, 2 Champions League wins, 7 FA Cups. They have massively benefited from it. Current Premier League champions as well. Man City are now back to winning Premier Leagues as well. Interesting to see Millwall, who of course got promoted really early on. They benefited from a championship that was decimated by points deductions, snuck into the Premier League, never really left, and benefited from never getting any punishment at all. They were never in the Premier League in its original form, but got into it as soon as they had the opportunity to, once all this kicked off. And despite they had a couple of seasons where they dropped back down again, but other than that, I don't know why there's no points showing for those seasons. That's a bit confusing. But other than that, they have been Premier League stalwarts and very much a Big Six team now because they were able to spend. Wolves did make it back up, as did Leeds. There's no sign of Arsenal or Spurs, so it looks like they never really made it back. Manchester United did. If we drop down into the Championship, so Arsenal losing in the playoff final. Tottenham down in mid-table as well. MK Dons actually outgrew Tottenham despite getting whacked with a massive punishment of their own. Villa and Leicester stuck down in the Championship as well. If we have a look at League One, QPR had a punishment. It's not unusual to see QPR, Bolton, Coventry down at this level. West Ham obviously had a huge punishment because they'd been in the Premier League a long time, so they've not really recovered from their punishment yet. They've been hit pretty hard by all of this. League Two, we've got Watford, who weren't massively punished, to be honest. Neither were Portsmouth. This is just them being a bit Watford and Portsmouthy. Blackpool relegated out of League Two. Charlton, again, these are teams who had minimal punishments. Swindon, you can't blame these positions on the punishments that they were given. But what we are looking for is Everton and Blackburn, and Wigan getting promoted back into the Football League there. But it looks like Everton and Blackburn did not recover. Everton 4th in the National League North, Blackburn 10th. They're trying to clamber their way back up, but the damage was done. It's really interesting to see how differently. I mean, Everton and Chelsea got the same punishment. Chelsea stayed a top 6 team all the way through. Everton almost ceased to exist and briefly fell out of the playable leagues. And I guess that all comes down to the facilities and the youth setup that they had initially, or reputation, or I don't know. Offer me your theories down below. I could keep going forward forever on this, but I think we are going to call it here on this video. It's been quite a long one as is. I mean, this has just been absolute chaos, me playing around in the editor and just seeing what I can do. I've really enjoyed doing this. It's very different from any kind of video I've done before. If you want to see more of this kind of thing, let me know in the comment section and let me know what other scenarios we could come up with. And as with all of these experiment and rebuild videos, as and when we hit 5,000 likes on this video, I'll release the save file so you can have a play around in it as well and maybe keep it going and see if you can take Everton or Blackburn back to the glory days, because they would be quite good fun saves. But if you have enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a nice big thumbs up on there for me. Subscribe to the channel for daily Football Manager videos, and thank you very much for watching.